My Lords, I should perhaps declare my position as the co-chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Hong Kong. And I'll begin with a short list of things to agree with. I very much agree with the comments of the Noble Lord, Lord Fox, not currently in his place, in his remarks, particularly about privacy. And I will associate myself very much with the remarks of the Noble Lord, Lord Alton of Liverpool, in terms of when we're talking about trade, when we're talking about commerce, we have to be thinking about human rights aspects as well. That and environment, as in the Environment Bill, this all interlinks together. And the targeting of the Uyghurs, the situation in what the locals called Alta is a situation of genocide, and we simply cannot stand by. Just to finish down the tick list, debates that were issues that were covered in the other place, and a number of noble lords have also covered. Once again, we find ourselves, as on pretty well every bill, there isn't adequate scrutiny of the powers of the Secretary of State. Again, a very familiar story. Ofcom, will it have resources to complete the role that's foreseen for it in this bill? And we don't, again, have written in sufficient consultation with devolved governments. However, in today's remarks, I wanted to start with a bit of a longue durée perspective, an overview, because we are once again in the context of privatisation. We're talking about what used to be a public service run for public good, our telecoms network, which was, for ideological reasons, handed over to the private sector, to a privatisation that's been allowed to become a Wild West. And now we're trying to coin a phrase, try to take back control of that Wild West. And I think it's increasingly clear, and by actions, if not words, the government is acknowledging that telecoms is now an essential service, a utility, just as much as water or energy supplies are, and that these are issues that we need to think about for a larger future, thinking about running them for public good, not private profit. But in terms of looking particularly at the bill, I'm going to focus particularly on Clause 1, which amends the Sections 105 of the Communications Act. And this focus here is on compromising security. Now, the noble Baroness Lady Morgan and the noble Lord Vasey, among others, have talked about the idea of security as being comprehensive. And indeed, if we look at subsection 2A here, it says a security compromise is anything that compromises the availability, performance or functionality of the network or service. Now, to think about what might compromise our services, I'd invite noble lords to look across at America right at this moment. And in America right at this moment, there is a massive record heatwave. Just to quote one set of figures, Portland, the city of Portland, has had 3 days in which it's broken at record temperatures by matters not of points of degrees, but of degrees. Today, the top temperature in Portland is 46.6 degrees Celsius. For those who prefer, like the Americans, prefer a more old-fashioned system, that's 116 degrees Fahrenheit. And what's happening is literally the infrastructure is melting in a very, very literal sense. What you have are what are being described as non-linear and threshold effects, where systems just go down utterly, totally and completely because they just cannot cope with the environmental conditions. Now, I would say if we look back to section clause 2A here, compromising the availability, performance and functionality of the network, I'm going to agree with Boris Johnson, who said as he was chairing the UN Security Council earlier this year that climate change is a threat to our security. So my question really to the noble lady, the Minister, is it would seem to me very clear that this bill tackles these kinds of issues, or should tackle these kinds of issues. Does the government regard it as that? And if it doesn't, what other steps is the government taking to tackle these issues? And to really stress what I've seen this happening firsthand, not just looking across at far distant structures. I happened to be in Lancaster a few days after it was affected by very serious, well, the flooding wasn't that serious. What was really serious was it took out the city's electricity supplies for about 2.5 days. And all of the effects, when I saw the people about a week or so later, people were really, the city was shocked because the effects no one had really thought of. Nearly all of the student accommodation had electric security doors. No electricity, you have a massive problem of access. In a flood, you normally put people into emergency accommodation hotels. Electronic key cards, no electricity, no access to hotel rooms. Of course, the cash machines went out. The petrol stations, their pumps didn't work. And this is where I really come to a broader question when we're thinking about the security and telecoms and indeed our whole increasingly digitalised world. Now, this is, I think we're all agreed, a fairly small and modest bill, but we know also that the government is planning what's been described as an Internet of Things bill. I believe it's called the Product Security and Telecoms Infrastructure Bill. And when it comes to all of these issues, these are really big existential issues about our security, our survival, the ability of our basic systems to function, to provide people with food, water, the essentials that they need. And so I would really think this is an ideal time to ask the government whether it really has considered a question about how much IT, how much telecoms, how much digital integration do we actually need? And I refer here to the words of the Noble Lord Stirrup. And the Noble Lord said, "We cannot assume any attack will fail." Well, the kind of breakdowns I'm talking about are not necessarily an attack in those terms, but they can be absolutely disastrous, as Lancaster illustrated. And so yesterday in the Environment Bill, the Noble Lord Barclay, talking about damage to the environment, said the first question we should ask is, do we actually need the thing that we're building that's destroying the environment? And so I think we really have to ask about the digitisation of our society, the incorporation of everything linked together through 5G, is do we actually need these linkages, and what kind of vulnerabilities are they actually creating? So I think that's the main point I wanted to make. I do also want to pick up a couple of other small points. One is, I'm sorry, I've forgotten which Noble Lord said it now, but there was a discussion about how what we have now is a situation of market failure. And the government explicitly is saying, associated with this bill, it has a diversification strategy to try and see that we have more different producers, different suppliers. I'd like to ask the Noble Lady Minister whether the government is looking at direct research funding, direct support for that kind of diversification, because market failure has got us into this situation where there's very little diversity, and relying on the market to fix that is, I would suggest, very difficult, not necessarily going to be successful. And I point out, of course, that if we go back to the origins of all the things that got us to this point today, it was government funding that created the TCP IP protocol. It was government funding that funded the people researching that created the World Wide Web. We really have to think about ensuring that we put government funds into things if we really believe that they're needed. So that's pretty well all I wanted to say. Just one final thought. Again, coming back to that issue of resilience. We are in a situation now of huge supply problems. We're talking about not allowing certain supplies into the country, but we have, of course, a global chip shortage. And I'm relying on anecdote here, but I have a friend who's a manager in a fairly large public service who simply isn't able to upgrade the Wi-Fi because it's impossible to get the technology to buy the bits of kit needed to do that because of the chip shortage. And I go to, going beyond anecdote, to a report in the Financial Times, quoting major infrastructure company, manufacturing company Flex, which says this chip shortage is likely to continue for another year. So we are stuck in a situation where we have very fragile, just-in-time, complex global supply chains. We have companies that we're saying we cannot use anymore. We are in a situation where resilience needs to be something that's thought about a great deal more.